the N64 cartridges were $70. Now, you look at the console and it's $200 price point, and it's actually not bad, right? All things considered, but knowing that we pretty much got this massive lineup of games. We're talking about 2 games, and Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings. What did you think about that price point? And considering inevitably you have the one main game most people are going to get.
It was very much a one-trick show in the Nintendo 64 launch lineup, but something I just learned is that this was a Nintendo system that did not come with a pack-in game. So yes, even like in 1996 standards, the $200 price point is pretty good. But the fact that you had to add on that $60, $70 on top of it, you can't really call it a $200 console at that point. So when you compare that against something like the Nintendo or the Super Nintendo at launch, it's a pretty hard sell probably in 1996 terms. Like, yes, you had an amazing game sitting right there, and most of the conversation was, oh my god, you need to see this game. You need to try Super Mario 64. But it was something that you had to throw a little more money out to do so. And yeah, that must have been one of the first times in history that a Nintendo console did that, if not the first.
And I just wanted to say, like, you brought up a really interesting point, and I want to, after talking about this, I want to take it to Ryan. You mentioned it's like, here's the launch, price, but then there's always the pack-ins. In this case, you always want to get a game. And, just before this, we got the PS1, and this was the generation where, yeah, you have the game, you have the console, but hey, you got to fork over $40 and you got to get yourself a memory card. So it's an interesting strategy where companies will try to have the lowest price point possible, knowing that at the end of the day, you're not really spending that, right? Because with the N64, you can get up to 3 additional controllers.
So once you get that memory card in Super Mario 64, really it's a $300 console at that point.
Absolutely. So yeah, Brian, in your case, like, talk to me about that. It's finally out, September 29th, 1996. 2 games, about $70 a pop. What do you think?
It's lucky that it had a very, very good game to come out with it, right? Because a 2-game launch is a little bit weak, and not even just a little bit weak, it's super weak. But when one of your 2 games is one of the greatest video games of all time that people still play very actively to this day, that definitely helps carry you through the next few months when you start to get more titles coming out. But luckily, Super Mario 64 was so good that it kept people busy. And of course, the other game being Pilotwings is a fine game in and of itself. But let's be honest, everyone was talking about and playing Super Mario 64.
Yeah, Pilotwings wasn't exactly setting the world on fire the way that Super Mario 64 was. I played it a little bit back in the day, but not all that much. Like, yeah, Pilotwings kind of gets forgotten by its extremely successful older brother in Super Mario.
And by the way, so a lot of the things we'll be pulling articles from. I want to give a credit to businessinsider.com and nintendo64.fandom.com. So as I mentioned before, the launch date for North America was September 29th, 1996. Now, Japan got it a little bit before that on June 23rd of that same year. Now, I always thought as a kid, and this is why, once again, I love working on this podcast. It's like you're able to validate, like, Keith, thought differently about the launch lineup and all that. I was always under the impression, because Japan always gets so many games that we don't get, right? And I know it was still the case here, but apparently they only got one more game in Japan, and it was some kind of a board game type of deal, like a visual board game. So it's really interesting to see that when you look at the launch lineups in a console, usually they'll try to have like a fighting game, a racing game, a little bit for everybody, right? Because if Ryan and I are in the same household, we may both be gamers, but that doesn't mean we play the same game. Yet here, Nintendo just said, look, if you don't like Super Mario 64, we got ourselves a problem. Like, looking back, would you have liked to have them added another genre? And if so, what do you think was missing? Maybe not even necessarily a specific game, but it's like we have platformer. Pilotwings, you can call it it's not an adventure game because of the type of game. It's a weird genre, right?
It's a flying game, really. You got to hit those rings. Yeah. You got to hit those rings, and that's all you got. But honestly, I would say that this generation is an exception for me in the way that 2D to 3D is arguably one of the biggest jumps in video game technology. And the fact that it took a little longer for everybody to catch up and the launch of the Nintendo 64 suffered for it, like, I think this is an instance where people get a pass for that one just because of how significantly the industry was moving forward with that one. But hypothetically, if I were to add something, I would add something like a fighting game to that, just because I'm not going to call it a cash grab, but there were so many big fighting game franchises that they could have leaned on. And I mean, really, later on in the N64's lifetime, they leaned on all of the Mortal Kombats, the Killer Instincts, the Clay Fighters of the world. That would have been something that would have added at least that name value to beyond Nintendo to the N64 lineup that it was missing.
Just to piggyback off of what Keith was saying, I do think a little bit of variety would have helped, but again, Mario 64 was such a revolutionary game that it really was carrying it, and I think because at this point, the PlayStation's already been out and they just need to get the system out. They couldn't really wait any longer. So their hands were kind of tied in this situation. But I think having a sports game or another, like, a racing game, because Pilotwings wasn't really a racing game, either of those could have really helped kind of pad out a little bit more variety.
I think, and it's interesting because it's relevant now. I would have loved like a cruising game because, like, I love me those cruising games like Cruising World, Cruising USA. Now they just came out with a new one that's out on Switch, which is just like super odd to think about. But Keith, you brought up an amazing point there that I never thought about, which is, what if Nintendo by design said, look, we've seen our fair share of bad 3D games. And I mean, launch lineups usually are cluttered with them. So maybe Nintendo
look at
said
the PlayStation 1.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps Nintendo speculated and said, look, let's direct the attention to the thing we know works. Because that way, if people get a really good first impression, then that paves the way for other games. Versus imagine they came out with like 10 games and 9 of them were crappy 3D games, and you'd be thinking to yourself, oh man, maybe 2D is still like the way to go. Hey, we really hope you enjoyed this podcast clip, and if you did, guess what? You can listen to the full episode right now by searching for Quest Rewind on your favorite podcast app, including Spotify. And while you're at it, follow us over there so you never miss a new episode.